Thanks, Jana. Thanks, Miko. The observance of Martin Luther King Jr. Day has become a time to reflect on history and a tribute to those who've overcome suffering and injustice, and praise for a powerful and sustaining God. On MLK Sunday at Parkview, we honor the history of people who stood with courage and pushed forward with faith. We hear stories of brave reformers who are people of color and people of faith. Ida B. Wells, an American investigative journalist and newspaper editor, was an early leader in the civil rights movement in America. She dedicated her life to combating prejudice and violence and the fight for African American equality, especially for women. In 1862, Ida B. Wells was born enslaved in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Emancipation came in 1865. It was a brand new day. Her daddy could vote now, and he did. And he helped found Rust College. Her family bought property and developed farms. They were getting ahead, but then times were changing. By the time she was 22 on May 4th, 1884, Ida B. Wells bought a first-class train ticket, but they wouldn't let her ride in that car. When she refused to move, they threw her off the train, but not before she bit one of the porters. Wells sued the railroad and she won. Then the Tennessee Supreme Court overturned it. She became an investigative journalist because of her friend Thomas Moss. Moss was a hard-working family man with a lovely wife and home. They had a baby on the way. Moss was well-liked in town. He was a good businessman. He opened a store called the People's Grocery with two business associates in Memphis, Tennessee. It was an amazingly successful store. People came in and bought just about anything they could want. Fresh bread at the bakery counter, penny candy, pickles from a barrel. Everybody in the neighborhood was pleased, except for William Barrett, the white grocer down the street, who saw his business dwindle. That's when the trouble started. The white grocer was stirring up animosity against the People's Grocery. A mob formed and attacked the store. They got inside and shots were fired. The sheriff came, but the only ones arrested were the store owners. They were thrown in jail. But before they came to trial, the downtown jail was stormed by a white mob, and the three grocers were dragged out, taken to a nearby rail yard where one by one they were murdered. The last to die was Ida's friend, Tom Moss. Before they finished him off, they said, "You have any last words?" He said, "Tell my people to go west. There's no justice for them here." Because Tom Moss was a successful businessman, he was murdered. Ida wrote, "He was murdered with no more consideration than if he was a dog." The colored people feel that every white man in Memphis who consented in his death is as guilty as those who fired the guns which took his life. And that's why she became an investigative journalist. She said, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." So she wrote articles for the newspaper to expose the lynchings. She published a pamphlet called Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in all its phases. In it she wrote, "The people must know before they can act, and there is no educator to compare with the press." Because she reported on incidents of racial segregation, inequality, and lynching, a white mob ransacked her Free Press newspaper office in Memphis. They destroyed all her equipment. They ran her co-editor out of town. Being in Philadelphia at the time likely saved her life. She said, "Having lost my paper, had a price put on my life, and been made an exile in my home for hinting at the truth, I felt I owed it to myself and to my race to tell the whole truth." She moved to Chicago, met Ferdinand Barnett, a man who was the first black assistant state's attorney in Illinois. They had 4 children. Wells was one of the first American women to keep her maiden name, which she hyphenated, Wells Barnett. The 1892 lynching of her close friend, Tom Moss, marked the beginning of her anti-lynching career. She estimated that nearly 3,500 men, women, and children were lynched between 1885 and 1912. She wrote articles criticizing lynching and risked her life traveling back to the South to investigate lynchings. She said lynching was a way to keep blacks, who are very economically prosperous and competitive at this point, to keep them down. She brought her anti-lynching campaign to the White House. In 1898, she called for President McKinley to treat lynching as a federal crime. And she later met with President Woodrow Wilson to seek his support for racial equality. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Sometimes justice is many years in the making. It wasn't until March 2022 that both houses of Congress passed an anti-lynching bill. President Joe Biden signed it into law on March 29, 2022. That's a long time coming. It's been said that during her lifetime, Wells was the most famous black woman in America. Few were more passionate than she about the role women could play at a time of mob rule and Supreme Court sanctioned segregation. She was an active fighter for women's suffrage, especially black women. She founded the Alpha Suffrage Club, the first black suffrage club in Chicago. And she was invited to march in the 1913 suffrage parade in D.C. on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. On March 13, 1913, thousands of suffragists from across the country descended on the Capitol. Ida was in a D.C. rehearsal hall with 64 other Illinois suffragists. While they were rehearsing, they got word from national organizers who had decided that the Illinois contingent was to be entirely white. Women of color were informed that they wouldn't be welcome to march in the parade. They needed to stay in the back. Wells told them that if they didn't take a stand now in this parade, that the idea of their equality was lost. She told them she'd march with them or not at all. But the leader of their contingent sided with the segregation order, so she left. When the women began marching next day, Ida was nowhere to be found, but suddenly appeared out of the crowd to take her place with the Illinois delegation. With 2 white suffragists on each side of her, Wells proudly marched with the head ladies of the Illinois delegation, thereby proving that you can't spell formidable without Ida. She ran for the Illinois Senate the year before she died. She didn't win, but she continued to create paths for black women. And in 2020, Ida B. Wells was posthumously awarded a Pulitzer Prize special citation for her outstanding and courageous reporting on the horrific, vicious violence against African Americans during the era of lynching. Jesus said in Matthew 5, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. Your light must shine before people in such a way that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven. Didn't Ida B. Wells' light shine? A gifted writer, she spent her life combating prejudice and violence and fighting for African American equality, especially for the women. In the eyes of the FBI, this made her a dangerous race agitator. They kept a file on her. In the annals of history, it made her an activist who transformed society. Like her contemporaries, Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, Ida B. Wells left an indelible mark on American history. Although she faced death threats, the loss of her newspaper, and exile from the South, she spoke candidly about the injustices she saw all around her. Her journalism and activism and one-on-one advocacy with government leaders spoke truth to power as she took control of the Black narrative to challenge an oppressive system and move toward fuller equality. Her life work brings to mind Jesus' words in Luke. Will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will God keep putting them off? I tell you, God will see that they get justice. In his letter from the Birmingham jail, Dr. King wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied to a single garment of destiny." Ida B. Wells spent her life working to bring God's justice to others. Her belief that she and other people of color deserved all the opportunities and freedoms that were the promise of the United States was a driving force in her life. She refused to let societal restrictions limit or define her desire for justice. She fought for justice and equality in education, in housing, employment, in the law, and in politics. Her tactic of truth-telling as a weapon to challenge the unequal systems and structures helped push our country forward toward freedom many had never known. Michelle Duster, Wells' great-granddaughter, wrote in her book, Ida B. the Queen, that Ida B. Wells Barnett is more than a historical figure. She's someone who serves as an inspiration for current and future generations. The theme for MLK Day 2024 is transforming the dream. The goal this year is empowering a new generation of positive social change makers like Dr. King and Ida B. Wells Barnett. Her life wasn't easy. She endured death threats. She lost friends to lynching. She lost her teaching job because she spoke up against inequality. She lost her printing press when she spoke up against injustice. But through it all, she stayed focused on truth-telling. She believed that her voice was important, that her story needed to be heard. Her legacy of working for justice and equality and inclusion for everyone was empowered by God's call to the church and to each of us to be a blessing, to bring healing, peace, and opportunities for well-being for everyone. Our faith in God's love, just like hers, brings us guidance on that justice journey. As we in America continue to confront the unfinished business of racism, we offer heartfelt thanks to Ida B. Wells, an activist whose deep faith in God's justice compelled her to work for the transformation of society. 93 years after her death, Wells reminds us of the power we all hold to bring down present oppressive circumstances and work to bring God's justice to all. Amen.